Hey and welcome back. There's one Machrihanish secret story that I've not told you yet, and that was the story that introduced the name Machrihanish to the world. And that's when Nick Pope was economical with the truth and actually, I choose my words carefully, used chutzpah in his reply to Scottish members of Parliament in London. Hey lovely people, today the Nick Pope Machrihanish cock-up. But it truly was a cock-up, probably not just by Nick Pope, probably by his greater department at the MOD. But what it exposed is some real secrets about what really was going on at Machrihanish with secret aircraft. So as you know, I grew up in Kintyre, a wee peninsula off the west coast of Scotland with a 10,000 foot, Nick, it's not 9, it's not 13, it's 10,000 foot runway pointing directly at North America, north of Northern Ireland. A clear run from the Americas to Europe and back. It was a perfect base for secret transatlantic flights. It was even a designated space shuttle emergency landing field. It had the runway length, it had the VASIs, which is the vertical glide slope lights, it had the special NASA searchlights. It was on the chart. It's also available for commercial airliners who have trouble maybe with a bomb scare or a mechanical problem, because it's the first Scottish runway you hit when crossing the Atlantic. Shannon in Ireland also serves that purpose, but Machrihanish was there in an emergency and had some unique facilities which I know about and will tell you about today. So before I tell you what Nick Pope said wrong and how it caused a international incident, let me explain some context. I grew up in Machrihanish and everybody in the local Campbelltown, Kintyre area heard things, saw things, and knew people who worked at the base. So we know that things were flown into there as test vehicles, and we were good. We kept quiet about it. But in the 1990s, Scotland was changing. The Scottish National Party and Scottish National MPs were getting peed off with foreign powers using their nation of Scotland specifically for nuclear weapons in Faslane, and at Machrihanish were something called forward nuclear bases. The concept of forward nuclear weapons is, if America is taken out with a nuclear strike, it still retains an ability to strike back because it's got nuclear weapons in Scotland and elsewhere, in Holland and in Italy and in Turkey. And I asked a very senior American diplomat about this, and his reply was, they're dual key. But what's dual key? I failed to ask a supplementary question. Does dual key mean that it takes two of us to turn the keys, plural, and launch the missiles, or either have ability to use them because they're there? I don't know if you know the exact definition of a dual key forward nuclear missile program. You know where it is. It's always down there. That's just silly to be a point, but comments, please, people. But let's get back to Scotland and how they weren't happy about Machrihanish. They knew from locals like me and my family that weird things were going on in the Mull of Kintyre. Strange things were seen and heard. And the rumour was, and it's logical, that aircraft were crossing the Atlantic from America, landing at Machrihanish, refueling and taking off again in the middle of the night. And Scottish MPs, members of Parliament in London, asked a question to the MOD. And their specific question was, are foreign aircraft entering the British defence area? This is a radar blanket round the wee island of Great Britain that often gets jets scrambled if somebody is coming too close to it. I mean, it was very much in the Cold War where Russian bombers would come towards the border of the British Isles defence area, and Jaguars and Tornadoes would be scrambled to escort them away. So the question was, is there stuff landing inside the British radar defence area with the knowledge of the MOD? Possibly American secret aircraft. But that was a supplementary question. That question was asked in Parliament. That question needed an answer. That question went to Nick Pope's department. And Nick Pope says in this interview, I'll show you a clip from, that he drafted, meaning wrote, the reply. It was a terrible reply. And as Nick says, he used, or his department used, chutzpah, meaning balls, to be economical with the truth in replying to the Scottish MP's direct question. They wanted to know whether American, which is the most likely source of an aircraft landing at Machrihanish, were entering British airspace. And did the MOD and the RAF know about it? Because they wanted to have a policy in Scotland that limited military use of their country. And Nick Pope drafted this reply.
One of the things that I got drawn into was basically answering when members of Parliament and peers, so members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, they can ask formal questions of the Secretary of State for Defence. We received a whole bunch of questions along the lines of, is there an Aurora program? Has the United States government been test flying it in the UK air defence region? Has it, and this was a big allegation, been operating out of RAF Machrihanish, an airbase on the west coast of Scotland, which I think had a runway which was something like, I can't remember, it was either 9,000 or 12,000 feet long. It was the only airbase in the UK that could take the space shuttle if it had to do an emergency landing. And because it was on the west coast of Scotland, it was perfectly placed if the US did want to test some sort of secret prototype aircraft, but not fly it over too much by way of landmass. It could do a transatlantic flight, and it could land at Machrihanish without really flying over any of the mainland UK. So we got these questions, and I can't believe, in a sense, the chutzpah of these replies that we got away with it. But I drafted. I mean, I was the subject matter expert, and in junior managerial grade, drafting these responses for the Secretary of State to give back to whoever asked. And I think after consultation with the US authorities and our own detective work over whether this existed or not, we answered, and you can read this in Hansard, which is the official record of UK parliamentary proceedings. One of the responses said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, but the existence of any such program would be a matter for the US authorities. Now that, frankly, I'm the first to admit that was outrageous, because that was not the question. The question was not, does Aurora exist? That was only the first part of it. It was, and is it flying in UK airspace? So the first part of the question, fair enough, that was a matter for the US. But anything flying in our own airspace was absolutely a matter for the UK authorities. But I thought, I'll put it up. I'll see if we get away with it. We probably won't, but we did.
He diverted the question of answering whether aircraft were coming into the military operational defense zone by saying, you're going to have to ask the Americans about their secret project. Well, hang on. They kind of implied that it might be an American plane, but what they were really asking for, Nick, was there stuff landing in Machrihanish in Scotland? And you didn't answer it. Why? Well, I'm assuming you were instructed to divert the question and not admit the answer, because I know the truth. I know facts about actually what happened, and so does the MOD, of course, and I'll get on to that. But first, what happened was the answer caused a diplomatic row. Let me explain this. So the Scottish MP's question and Nick's answer that you have to ask the Americans went to the British Embassy in Washington, where the ambassador contacted Donald Rice, I think that's his name, the Defense Secretary of the US Air Force, and said, "Oh, Donald, what's this about a secret American project landing in Scotland?" And Rice went ballistic and caused a real incident, and the whole thing blew out of all proportion in the United States and back at the MOD. But to understand why it caused so much trouble, you have to understand a bit of history and context. So in Congress, other members of Congress were intrigued that there was a note in a procurement plan called Aurora, and it was linked to billions of US dollars. And they wanted to know where the taxpayers' money was being spent. So they asked specifically the head of the US Air Force, this Rice character, to make a statement in Congress. And Rice said to Congress, under oath, there is no such project as Aurora, right? So when the British ambassador saunters into the US Air Force office and says, "What's this, old chap, about a secret Aurora spy plane landing in Scotland?" Obviously, Secretary Rice had to say, "No, go away. You can't ask me about this because I've already answered it. I've said under oath in Congress that there's no such program. So you can't come from Britain and ask me, is it really landing in Well, he wouldn't have said that. He would have said, is it really landing in Machrihanish? And Rice obviously said, you're causing an incident here. It's not something that I can talk about. But all of that, to me, who likes to look at the big picture, as you know, is really revealing. First of all, let's go through what actually is fact. Why did Nick Pope and his department, not to point the finger at you, Nick, say, ask the Americans? Because you knew. It's an RAF base. It's a co-production between, there's an American commander at Machrihanish and there was an RAF commander at Machrihanish. I went to school with their kids. My father worked with them. I know this is true. And as a local lad, as a bit of a journalist, as a history of working for the BBC and a science researcher, it's really easy to find some facts about what really went on at Machrihanish. And for me, the big clue was people I knew at this place. This is the POL refueling depot in Campbelltown Loch, which is about 7 or 8 miles from Machrihanish. And it had underground tanks of fuel in the hillside. It was about half a mile from my parents' house. It is a Zulu base, Z. That means that a Royal Navy nuclear submarine with a reactor containment vessel breach or some other nuclear incident can dock there and it can be coped with. There's only 2 or 3 of these in the whole of the UK. And this Zulu base is about 3 miles from Woolworths in Campbelltown. And people I went to school with told me that in the base there was boxes of iodine tablets, because if there was a nuclear accident, they would hand them out to me and the local population in Campbelltown and Kintyre, if not Ayrshire, whatever, depending on how serious it was. But he also told me something very interesting. Most of the underground tanks contained bunker fuel for Royal Navy frigates and minesweepers that would regularly pull in and be topped off with fuel for the ships. But there was a number of wee containers with what he called weird stuff or exotic fuels. For example, it contained, the Americans needed a different fuel for their ships. The Americans need a very specific fuel for aircraft carrier aircraft on board. It's different from the Royal Navy aircraft. It's not just Jet A1, it's a special American serial number, and they had to have tanks of that stuff. But they also had weird stuff. And way back in the 1990s, there was something called the Diggers Hotline. If you were a farmer and you were digging a hole in your field somewhere between Campbelltown and Machrihanish, you could look up whether you were going to dig into something secret. And it was published. I mean, it was like you needed to know whether you were going to go through a pipeline or a gas supply. That information is now classified. If you try and look up information on what's underneath your house since 9/11, you cannot find it. But way back in the day, in the 1990s, when this incident happened, it proved, because you could buy a map at the council office of where there was a pipeline from the POL Zulu nuclear base to Machrihanish, which is a joint RAF and American base. And jet fuel was specifically supplied, and I'll tell you something, it wasn't just jet fuel, but how much of it was actually put through the pipeline and how much was just taken in tankers from the POL base to Machrihanish is above my pay grade. But that proves that Nick Pope's department, the MOD, knows about what's happening at Machrihanish, knows that they can refuel exotic aircraft. They paid for it. They bought the nozzle. You know, there's a filling station that says low lead, diesel, and UFO. No, I'm joking, but somewhere there was. It popped out the ground at Machrihanish. And that was paid for by you, if you're British, by taxpayers' money. Because the MOD knew what was actually going on at Machrihanish. The planes were refueled in or outside the hangar, turned around, and went back to America. So, yes, there were secret American planes landing at Machrihanish. And Nick Pope knew about it. And by saying, you're going to have to ask the Americans, he was being, at the best, economical with the truth. And two, I think, misleading Scottish National Party MPs who wanted to know what was really going on at Machrihanish. Today, I can definitely say the truth is now out there. Thank you for watching. If this is the kind of film that you enjoy, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more, because there's a whole lot more stories like this coming your way. and consider becoming a Patreon for early access to these stories and becoming involved in the research. It's fun. I have some amazing patrons that you can meet, and you can directly email me with your ideas and questions. Thank you so much.